Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for spending your night with us. Just to kind of, qualify why I'm in front of you tonight. David is correct. We are a two-pronged social enterprise. I am, by all intents and purposes, an accidental social entrepreneur. I thought I would spend my last days on this earth working for nonprofits, and we make our plans and life laughs. Our social enterprise does do consulting work with environmental organizations predominantly, but we also work with community-based organizations that want to address their racial homogeneity within their organization. And then we use those proceeds to fund our environmental conservation programs, which essentially train and engage young people of color predominantly in environmental career pathways. So we have a few different programs. We have our Conservation Corps program, which works directly with Milwaukee County parks, doing invasive species removal, wetland surveys. We also have an urban agriculture program. We do, let me back up a little bit here. We also have a green infrastructure program, which is a partnership with MMSD, the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewerage District. This is intended to connect, again, young people, predominantly of color, and other folks with underrepresented identities in environmental engineering, in water quality career pathways. And then we also have our urban agriculture program, which is a partnership with UW-Milwaukee and Milwaukee Public Schools and Employ Milwaukee. One of my favorites of this urban agriculture program is actually that the students get to grow their food, their produce, they sell it to area restaurants, that money goes right back into the program. And I don't know if I don't have a picture of it here, but if any of you are Brewers fans and you're going to a Brewer game this season, check out a stall that's called Roots for the Home Team. Those are typically going to be our students. They're selling salads with the produce that they grew themselves and that they created and designed and named. So they're very proud of their salads. And who doesn't want teenagers excited about salads? And right? And newly, this is one that I say is my favorite part about not being a nonprofit, is that we get to do political advocacy work around climate action. So we have a partnership with the Alliance for Climate Education, and we engage young people ages 14 to 20 in political advocacy around environmental science, getting them to use relational voter turnout practices to get their friends and family members to vote for politicians who actually care about our environment and want to implement more equitable and inclusive practices that protect our earth and keep us healthy. So, I'm actually here tonight to talk to you all about why our green organizations are still predominantly white and what you can do about it. So before I get into that, however, I want to address a couple myths. And I want to do that because there are a couple of perspectives that keep us from even unpacking this work in a way that's useful, I guess, we'll call it that. So the first myth is that people of color just aren't interested in working for our organizations. And if they are interested, they're not qualified. Well, I think that if we believe people of color are not interested in working for our organization, if they're not interested in the environment, and they don't have the skills and the academic background for these jobs, then those aren't going to be the types of people we're going to seek out and recruit and attract and promote within our organization. So I want you to humor me for a moment, and I want you to think about what you think the number one way organizations recruit talent is. What would you say it is?
People they know.
People they know, right? Referrals, right? Over 90% of organizations hire people through referrals. So take a moment and think about the top 5 people you spend the most amount of time with who are not related to you, preferably. So not your significant other, ideally not your children or your family members, but outside of that, just if you can only think of 3, just think of 3. But get those names in your head, okay? And when you have those 3 to 5 names in your head, just give me a little church point. Just let me know you've got your folks. Yeah, just hold up there so I know everyone's okay, you got your people? Awesome. So now, think about those people and think about what's their gender identity or expression? What's their race or ethnicity? What's their age? Their sexual orientation? Their educational attainment level? Do they have a disability or not? What's their marital status? Or what's their caregiver status? Right? Do they care for an ailing parent, or are they a parent themselves? So think about those things. How similar are those demographics to you? So that's a problem with referrals, right? We like people who are like us. It's not a problem. It's actually a very normal human response, and that goes back to tribal periods, right? Where there's safety and sticking with people who are like you. Unfortunately, like many other things, we haven't evolved enough as a society to recognize that we don't necessarily need to do that anymore, again, depending on your personal identity in this world. But if we rely primarily on referrals, when we're looking for people to join our organizations, and our networks are predominantly homogenous, you kind of see the problem there, right? We end up with clones of ourselves. So that's one myth that I want to address. The next is that there's a really big disconnect between what environmental organizations say they value and what they're actually putting resources behind. So, for example, if I believe that my organization is already equitable and already fair, and everyone who should be here is here, and everybody who wants to be here is here, well, then I'm not going to take a very critical lens to my hidden culture, to my unspoken practices, to my policies, to evaluate whether or not I'm making decisions that are unduly benefiting and unduly burdening certain demographic groups. This right here is proof that we know that people of color are not only interested in these careers, they do at some point get into our organizations. The problem, however, is that we can't keep them. So this is taken directly from the Green 2.0 report. And I suggest that if you identify as anyone who cares about the environment, that is a report that you should be reading. The newest one just came out in January. But you'll see here that with nonprofits, government agencies, and foundations, these are the percentage of people of color in their organization from an internship level. Then we go into who was hired in the past 3 years. Then we go into leadership. Then we go into board slots. So as you can see, as we progress in our organizations, we often find a lot of diversity at that frontline level. The receptionist, right? Maybe the educator who works with children. But as we go further up in the organization, as the more power each of those positions hold, we find that the more white and the more male it gets. And actually, despite all of the efforts that have been made in the past few years around inclusion, these numbers have actually gotten worse. Now I can speculate on why that has happened over the past few years, but that'd be a whole nother workshop. So, all right. So the next myth is that diversity is a euphemism for people of color. When I used to work for the Student Conservation Association, one of our development directors would write grants stating how diverse our Milwaukee program was. The problem with that is that our program was over 80% self-identified as Black. So not diverse, it's actually pretty racially homogenous. So it got me thinking, why don't we just say what we mean? Why don't we just say that we want to attract people of color in our organizations, right? The other issue about using diversity as a euphemism for people of color is twofold. One is that it promotes the erroneous assumption that diversity means the exclusion of whites. It also promotes the notion that, well actually, let me backtrack. I think one of the number one reasons that people who identify as white perhaps struggle with conversations around race is because many folks who identify as white don't see themselves racialized. I often joke that I am part Black, part Choctaw Native, and regular. Right? Because we have this notion that, to be white is the baseline, and everything else is like the additional seasoning to our stir fry. And, that's really problematic when you think about it. David alluded to, to certain spaces not necessarily being for you as a white person. And I can tell you as a person of color, a lot of that is connected to the assumption that whiteness is the baseline and that white emotions and feelings must be catered to at all times, right? Even way of being, the way you present yourself should be, of this very Anglo-Saxon assumption. And sometimes people of color just need a space where they don't have to worry about catering to white people's feelings. I know that sounds really heavy, but I need you to hear me with this. And I understand that for many of you, you're probably hearing this for the first time. And that's okay, and that discomfort that you're feeling right now, you're probably feeling that because as a white person, you probably haven't spent your whole life having conversations about race. Whereas for many people of color, our whole lives revolve around navigating conversations about race and difference. So that's one aspect of white fragility, where you simply haven't been able to build that muscle. I realized that teaching other people how to have conversations about difference wasn't that I had some great PhD in this work. It was because I grew up in a family with a Catholic mother, a Jewish father. I tell people I'm a cashew all the time. Being multi-ethnic, having a brother that's Mormon. We're an interesting bunch. But I realized that not everybody grows up navigating that kind of difference so close to home. And that's okay. I get that I'm an anomaly, but the key is realizing that you don't have to be wrong, I don't have to be right, but we also have to understand that we all have blinders and we all have certain life experiences that inform how we view the world. And my favorite part about this work is helping people come together where they can not see differences in opinion as opposition, but rather as information. And not view that as a burden necessarily. The key though is for us to be aware of where our blind spots are, rather than trying to convince someone that they don't see what they actually see or they're not feeling what they're actually feeling. You feel me? Okay. So, as I mentioned, let me go back for a minute. Oftentimes, the culture of people of color is also conflated with poverty culture, and in my personal opinion, that's a very lazy way of hiking around some of the more rockier points of racism and discrimination. It's also a very convenient way to filter people of color out of a job applicant pool. So, again, diversity is not synonymous with people of color. In the same breath, though, diversity is not just the differences among us. Right? People love to say, we all breathe the same, and we all breathe the same air, and in fact, actually, we don't. I wouldn't even get into that. Again, this doesn't mean that this isn't true, it's just not the point, right? The point is that diversity is the unique differences between us based on how we experience the world, based on how we're treated in society, right? Raise your hand like really high if you are familiar with what's called a racially restrictive covenant. A racially restrictive covenant. Okay, awesome. There's more here than my usual audience, so that's great. So basically, many of us were led to believe that our city is so segregated. Many cities are segregated because people like to live with people who are like them, right? So we have, the Polish community over here, and the Mexican community over here, and the Black community here. That's by design. So up until 1968, before we had the Fair Housing Act, people of color were not permitted to purchase homes in certain areas, like Washington County, Ozaukee County, Cudahy, Franklin, right? What's that? Elm Grove, absolutely. And even though that sort of practice was outlawed in '68, we know that just because something becomes against the law doesn't mean we automatically have this change of heart overnight. We're like, oh, it's all good now, right? In fact, if we were to overlay a map of Milwaukee along with a redlining map, which is basically redlining is simply a little map that says, here's where you don't go, you can't get a mortgage here, right? And where do most of us Americans get our wealth from? Generation, our homes, right? My father got a GI, or a veteran loan, or a GI loan, I don't know. My dad's old as dirt, I love him, but when he came back, he could not, that loan was essentially useless because he couldn't, as a Black Jewish man, he could not purchase homes in certain areas. So imagine when we talk about how we just need to get over things because X, Y, and Z happened so long ago, we haven't been able to recover from that, right? Because even with the scholarships and the financial aid that was attributed to veterans, if you were only allowed to attend school at certain schools in certain locations, and that wasn't convenient for you and your family, again, that benefit was essentially useless. So anyway, off of my tangent. Another myth I want to just lay to rest is that Black and brown people are too busy being poor to care about the environment. Again, David alluded a little bit to this, that actually people of color care more about the environment when polled than whites. And I have that proved today, right here. So this research was done, I believe it was funded by Nature Conservancy, if I'm not mistaken, but it was polled by Fairbank, Maslin, Mullen and Associates. So when we look here at pollution of rivers, lakes, and streams, we can see that people of color, again, when compared with white voters, stated larger concern. Climate change, toxins and pesticides in our food and drinking water, pollution of our oceans. And actually, I don't have this highlighted, but even loss of working farms, when you look at Latinx communities and also communities of color as a whole, and there's a whole other reason why that's probably a little bit lower, which again, that's another workshop, we won't get into that today. Yeah, loss of habitat and fish for wildlife, and loss of natural areas. Yes?
I'm just wondering if that correlates with where people live.
Mm-hmm.
For example, perhaps people who, Black people who live,
Your infirmaries?
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
the air
Mm-hmm.
is worse, or the river is worse than
Mm-hmm.
where white guys go fishing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, I mean, it's easy to think, to have this sense of safety, even for us here in the Midwest, right? It can be challenging for us to think about how climate change, for example, affects us because we're not in the coastal areas, but we're actually seeing an increase in Lyme's disease. We're seeing an increase in poor air quality. We're having hotter summers, which is all correlated to violence, to health issues. So yes, absolutely. And because of that, that false sense of security, it can present this notion that we don't have to worry about that. So you're absolutely right. There's also a lot of indigenous and generational knowledge that is passed down in communities of color that it might not be passed down in the same way that it happens in white families, but it's there, and so, yeah. So speaking of thinking something's not a problem, another area of contention around implementing more equitable practices, I find, for a lot of environmental organizations, is this perception that, well, gosh, August, you're saying that children under the age of 4 right now are 50% more than 50% youth of color, right? And you're saying that by 2045, over 50% of the population is going to be consisting of people of color. So then if people of color are about to be the majority, we don't need to do anything, right? Like, it's gonna fix itself. Oh, how I wish that were so. We actually don't have to go much further than apartheid to know that just because you are the majority does not actually mean that you will hold the power. We just happen to think that because in our society, typically whites have historically held the most amount of power. The other aspect I want to point out is even how we are engaging in the conversation about our shifting racial demographics. So this is a perfect example of systemic whiteness. So this article talks about a tipping toward a white minority. Even in our language, we approach this work with a systemically white frame. And when we are not mindful of the language that we're using, again, it can continue to project the notion of othering to people who don't identify as white. All right, take a deep breath with me. Okay, so now let's actually get into what it is that we're doing that's causing these issues and how we fix it. So the number one reason that I see time and time again environmental organizations not be able to progress and implement change is that they're relying on good intent. Typically, when someone tells us we have dirt on our face, what's our normal response? Gosh, and thank you for telling me that, right? But for some reason, when we are told that, hey, I don't think you meant this that way, but what you actually said was actually pretty racist, or what you said was ableist or sexist, right? Or classist. What's the first thing we do? Me? I'm a good person. I would never. How could you say that, right? We go into defending ourselves rather because we think that being a good person is this fixed immutable trait. In reality, being a good person is like the bare minimum. Like that's like a C-, whatever the going rate is for passing these days in school. So in Green 2.0, when Dr. Taylor surveyed, I believe, over 300 different environmental organizations, she found that 75% of those organizations claim that diversity matters to them. And of course, here I am wondering, like, what's up with the other, percent? But only 49% of those organizations said that they would be likely to support or even take action to develop more inclusive practices and programs that would create more equitable career pathways. So unless we actually implement strategic practices and programs to not only select and attract and develop the people within our organizations, we're probably not going to keep them. So that's number one. Number two is that it's not enough to simply think that racism is bad. We have to be actively anti-racist. We have to be actively anti-sexist, anti-ableist, anti-discriminatory. And not just because this feels good or it's the nice thing to do. There's actually financial connections to this. McKinsey did a study where they found that gender diverse organizations are 15% more likely to financially outperform their non-gender diverse counterparts. Organizations that were ethnically diverse were 35% more likely to financially outperform their non-ethnically diverse counterparts. And yet, still, even with this knowledge, 97% of organizations fail to have a senior leadership that is representative of our US labor force. So let's talk about why that is. We don't recruit outside the club, right? The first thing we do when we've got a position open is we seek someone out from UW Stevens Point or some other far north, place. And not hating on Stevens Point, I try to get a lot of my core members to go there. I personally think it's one of the best natural resource schools in the country. But we have to keep in mind that Stevens Point has a diversity rate of about 4%. So we have to ask ourselves, do the organizations that we're trying to partner with even have the diversity to give? Mind you, people of color represent about 38% of our nation's population, and that number is rising. Here in Wisconsin, blacks actually only hold 4% of managerial and executive leadership positions, and that's data through the Bureau of Labor. So I love my fleece too, it keeps me nice and warm, but we kind of have this notion where we send nonverbal cues to people that say you belong and you don't belong, right? So just being mindful of, what sort of image are you presenting to the world? And I'm not saying you should lie and put a bunch of colorful faces on your websites if that's not who you are, but being very transparent about where you're trying to go and about what you might not have and how you think you could benefit with folks. And by all means, please do not go into communities of color trying to extract information from them. If you're going to seek out information or service into your organization, think about how you can compensate people. Because more often than not, people of color are often asked to join an organization, and then, because they're interested in environmentalism or natural resource management, and when they get in, it's kind of like this gotcha, and can you also tell us about ourselves and make sure that if we say something that's going to get us in trouble, you check us. That's a lot of weight, and that person may not have signed up for that. So third is that we haven't created pathways. I firmly believe that genius is equally distributed, but access is not. And so if we are looking for talent that looks a certain way, sounds a certain way, comes with a certain resume, then are we truly valuing all ways of knowing? Are we truly making ourselves accessible? And lastly, as I kind of alluded to, you haven't cleaned house, right? So people usually reach out to me when they have a position that's open, or whether it's a board position, or they start a program and they want to again add some flavor into it. They were making a stir fry and they were like, oh right, dang it, we gotta get the cumin and the salt. Don't add people of color into your organization as an afterthought, right? I was just talking about this, with someone tonight, about how a lot of times nonprofit organizations will go and create these solutions in their little silos, and then they bring it out to the community, we're here to help. Are you really? So I kind of like this little caricature here, but it does. It really kind of expresses this notion that before we start looking to recruit people into our organization, we have to take a very critical lens to how how we got here in the first place and start dismantling those practices and those policies, those unspoken cultures. Because diversity is not the goal, diversity is actually the outcome. It's the result of being an inclusive and an equitable organization. So just to recap, we want to set goals, not aspirations. We want to recruit outside the club. We want to create intentional pipelines. And we want to clean house. That's all I have.